April 19, 1945. Somewhere outside Nuremberg, Germany. Private First Class James Hendricks stands in the ruins of what was once a processing center for prisoners of war, now just another shattered building in a landscape of devastation. The air tastes of smoke and brick dust. Around him, German civilians and former Nazi personnel huddle in groups, awaiting processing by American forces. The Third Reich has 6 days left to live, though nobody here knows that yet. They only know the world has ended. Hendricks carries his last sea ration in his pack. He hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. His stomach has been complaining for hours, that hollow ache that becomes your constant companion in combat. The ration contains hash, crackers, a chocolate bar, instant coffee. It's not much, but it's everything. His next hot meal won't come until the supply trucks catch up, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Maybe never, the way this advance has been moving. Then he sees her. She's collapsed against a broken wall, barely conscious. Mid-30s, maybe younger, it's impossible to tell through the layers of dirt and exhaustion. Her clothes hang on a frame that's been starving for months. She wears the remnants of what might have been a nurse's uniform, or perhaps a factory worker's coverall, stained beyond recognition. Her hands shake uncontrollably. Her eyes stare at nothing. Hendricks watches as she tries to stand and fails. Tries again. Falls. Around her, other prisoners and civilians step over her, around her, past her. Nobody helps. In the calculus of survival that governs this landscape, she has already been written off. He makes a decision that violates every regulation about fraternization with enemy nationals. A decision his commanding officer explicitly forbade during this morning's briefing. A decision that, according to the propaganda he's been fed for 4 years, makes him a fool who's helping the very people responsible for this war. Private First Class James Hendricks walks over to the German woman, kneels beside her, and opens his last ration pack. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand who James Hendricks was before that April day. He's not a hero from central casting. Born in 1923 in Terre Haute, Indiana, Hendricks grew up during the Depression watching his father lose the family hardware store. He's the middle child of 5, quiet, unremarkable in school, the kind of kid teachers forget by summer. He works odd jobs after graduating high school in 1941, 6 months, whatever he can find, saving money to help his mother while his father drinks away the shame of unemployment. Pearl Harbor happens. Hendricks enlists in January 1942, age 19, motivated less by patriotism than by the simple calculation that the Army pays $21 a month plus meals. His family needs the money. He trains at Camp Roberts in California, learning to be an infantryman, which mostly means learning to follow orders and shoot straight. He's average at both. He ships to England in August 1943, crosses the Channel on D-Day +14, fights through the hedgerows of Normandy where he watches his best friend from basic training die in a ditch outside St. Lo. He fights through the Siegfried Line in the autumn rain, through the desperate German counteroffensive in the Ardennes that December where he spends 6 days in a frozen foxhole eating snow. He crosses the Rhine in March 1945 with the 7th Army, pushing into the heart of Germany as the Reich collapses. By April, Hendricks has been in combat for 11 months. He's killed men, though he doesn't know how many. He's seen things that will visit him in nightmares for the rest of his life. He's watched German soldiers machine gun American prisoners near Malmedy. He's walked through concentration camp subcamps where the smell of death lingers like fog. He has every reason to hate every German he encounters. Yet here's what his squad mates later remember about Hendricks. He's the guy who shares his cigarettes. The one who writes letters home for illiterate soldiers who can barely sign their names. The one who, during a brief rest period in a French village, spent 3 hours fixing a broken door for an elderly woman whose home had been damaged in the fighting. He never talks about it. He just does it. His platoon sergeant, Frank Morrison, will later say, "Hendricks wasn't special. That was the thing. He was just a regular guy who couldn't walk past somebody suffering without feeling like he should do something about it. Even when the somebody was supposed to be the enemy." Germany in April 1945 exists in a state beyond collapse. The word apocalyptic gets overused, but here it applies literally. The Thousand-Year Reich has lasted 12 years and now enters its final convulsions. The territory controlled by German forces shrinks daily as American, British, and Soviet armies converge from all directions. Cities that took centuries to build have been reduced to rubble in days. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin, Nuremberg, all transformed into landscapes of shattered stone and twisted metal. But the physical destruction, as total as it appears, represents only part of the catastrophe. The social order that governed German life has completely disintegrated. The Nazi Party apparatus that once controlled every aspect of civilian existence has vanished. Local officials have fled or committed suicide. Police have abandoned their posts. The currency is worthless. The ration system that kept the population fed has collapsed entirely. Millions of people are in motion, creating a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions. Refugees from the eastern territories flee westward ahead of the Soviet advance, carrying what they can, abandoning everything else. Foreign laborers, forced workers brought to Germany from occupied territories, now wander the roads seeking some way home. Released prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, bombed-out city dwellers, deserting Wehrmacht soldiers, all converge on roads choked with traffic going nowhere. Food has become the currency that matters. The official ration in Germany by April 1945 has dropped to approximately 1,000 calories per day for civilians, less than half what a human needs to survive. But even that meager allotment exists only on paper. Distribution networks have collapsed. Most civilians haven't seen their ration cards honored in weeks. They scavenge, barter, steal, or starve. Women suffer disproportionately. With millions of German men dead or captured, women comprise the majority of the civilian population. They bear responsibility for children, elderly parents, the wounded. They face unique dangers from occupying soldiers. They receive smaller rations than men under the Nazi system, a disparity that persists even as that system dies. Malnutrition among German women in April 1945 approaches levels seen in famine zones. Into this chaos comes the advancing American army, itself struggling with logistics. The speed of the Allied advance has outrun supply lines. Frontline units often operate on short rations. Ammunition arrives before food. Medical supplies run low. The soldiers liberating Germany are themselves tired, hungry, and increasingly cynical. Official policy toward German civilians remains deliberately harsh. Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower has issued strict non-fraternization orders. American soldiers are forbidden from helping German civilians, forbidden from sharing food, forbidden from showing sympathy. The reasoning is sound from a military perspective. These are the people who supported Hitler, who enabled the Holocaust, who started a war that killed millions. Why should American soldiers, who left homes and families to fight this war, now feed the enemy? Most soldiers follow these orders. Some enthusiastically. But some, like James Hendricks, cannot. The woman against the wall is named Margarete Fischer, though Hendricks never learns this. She's 34 years old, mother of 2 children she hasn't seen in 6 weeks. She worked as a seamstress in Nuremberg before the war, then in an aircraft parts factory when the men left for the front. Her husband died in Russia in 1943. Her factory was destroyed in an air raid 3 months ago. When the Americans approached Nuremberg, local Nazi officials conscripted every available civilian for labor battalions to dig anti-tank ditches. Fischer worked for 2 weeks on near-starvation rations, moving earth with a shovel until her hands bled. When the American artillery began falling, the Nazi supervisors fled. The laborers were left to fend for themselves. Fischer walked toward the American lines deliberately. Surrender seemed preferable to starving in the ruins of her city. She was rounded up with hundreds of others, processed as a prisoner of war despite being a civilian, because the overwhelmed American units couldn't distinguish anymore and didn't particularly care. For 3 days she's been in this holding area, with minimal food and less water. She weighs 97 pounds. Her body has been consuming itself for months. She suffers from severe malnutrition, dysentery, and the early stages of pneumonia. She is, in the medical terminology of the period, a goner. The kind of case that triage systems are designed to route away from limited medical resources because intervention would be wasted. Hendricks doesn't know any of this. He knows only what he sees, a human being dying. He kneels beside her and speaks, though she doesn't seem to hear. He opens the C ration, tears open the hash packet, and offers it to her. She stares at it without comprehension. He mimes eating. Slowly, understanding penetrates the fog in her eyes. She takes the packet with trembling hands and begins eating with desperate hunger, stuffing food into her mouth faster than she can swallow. Hendricks stops her gently, slowing her down. He knows that starving people who eat too fast can die from the shock to their system. He portions out the food slowly, making her take small bites, giving her sips from his canteen between each swallow. He gives her the crackers next, then the chocolate bar. He makes coffee using his tiny heating tablet, adding precious sugar from his own dwindling supply. The process takes 30 minutes. Other soldiers walk past. Some ignore them. Some stare. One lieutenant stops and demands to know what Hendricks thinks he's doing. Hendricks, still kneeling, says simply, "She needs food, sir." The lieutenant's face reddens. "That's a German soldier. We don't feed Germans. That's direct violation of non-fraternization policy. You want a court-martial." Hendricks continues feeding the woman. "Sir, I understand. But she's dying. I have food. I can't just watch her die." The standoff lasts perhaps 15 seconds, though it feels longer. The lieutenant, whose name nobody later remembers, faces a choice. He can enforce regulations and drag Hendricks up on charges. Or he can walk away and pretend he saw nothing. He looks at Hendricks, at the German woman, at the ruins surrounding them. Finally he says, "I'm walking away for 2 minutes. When I come back, this better be finished." He walks away. Hendricks finishes feeding Fischer. When she's consumed everything he has, when the empty ration packet lies crumpled beside them, she looks at him directly for the first time. Her eyes, sunken and ringed with dark circles, fill with tears. She tries to speak, chokes on the words, tries again. "Danke," she whispers. "Thank you." Hendricks nods. He doesn't speak German. But he understands. The immediate aftermath of Hendricks' decision ripples outward in ways he never anticipated. Word spreads quickly through his platoon. By nightfall, every soldier in his company knows that Hendricks gave his last ration to a German woman. Reactions split sharply. Some soldiers express contempt. Sergeant Bill Crawford, who lost a brother at Omaha Beach, corners Hendricks after evening formation. "You're a goddamn fool," Crawford says, voice thick with anger. "My brother is dead because of these people. You think one woman changes that? You think your charity makes a difference?" Hendricks doesn't argue. He simply says, "Maybe not. But she was dying right in front of me. I couldn't do nothing." Others quietly approve. That night, 3 different soldiers slip Hendricks portions of their own rations, extra crackers, a can of fruit, cigarettes to trade. They don't make speeches. They just leave the items on his bedroll and walk away. Private Eddie Walsh, who'd been in the same landing craft as Hendricks on D-Day +14, sits beside him and says, "That took guts. The lieutenant could have wrecked you." "I know," Hendricks replies. "Why'd you do it?" Hendricks thinks for a long moment. "I don't know exactly. I just kept thinking about my mom. What if she was starving somewhere and some enemy soldier had food? I'd want him to help her." The conversation becomes moot when Captain Richard Hayes, the company commander, summons Hendricks the following morning. Hayes is a West Point graduate, career officer, 29 years old, already being groomed for higher command. He's known for rigid adherence to regulations. Hendricks stands at attention in the makeshift company headquarters, a requisitioned German office with maps covering the walls. Hayes studies him for a long moment before speaking. "Private Hendricks, I understand you fed a German civilian yesterday despite direct orders forbidding such contact." "Yes, sir." "You understand that constitutes a violation of explicit policy?" "Yes, sir." Hayes leans back in his chair. "Why did you do it?" "She was dying, sir. I had food. It seemed wrong to let her die when I could help." Another long silence. Then Hayes does something unexpected. He opens his desk drawer, pulls out a chocolate bar, and places it on the desk between them. "That woman you fed? She's in our field hospital now. The doctors say another day without food and she would have died. Your intervention saved her life." He pushes the chocolate bar toward Hendricks. "This is from my personal supplies. Consider it a replacement for what you gave away." "And private? Off the record between you and me? I'm glad you did what you did, regulations be damned." "Dismissed." Hendricks takes the chocolate bar, salutes, and leaves, more confused than when he entered. But the real impact of Hendricks' action isn't measured in official reprimands avoided or chocolate bars received. It's measured in what happens to Margarete Fischer and how one act of humanity influences dozens of others. Fischer spends 4 days in the American Field Hospital, receiving intravenous fluids, antibiotics for her pneumonia, and careful refeeding to avoid refeeding syndrome, the dangerous condition that kills starving people who eat too quickly. She survives, though she'll battle health complications from malnutrition for years. On her 3rd day in the hospital, she asks the German-speaking medical orderly about the American soldier who fed her. She wants to thank him properly. The orderly makes inquiries, but by then Hendricks' unit has moved forward. They'll never meet again. But Fischer tells her story to other German civilians in the hospital. She tells it to the Red Cross workers who eventually help her reunite with her children. She tells it to her family, her neighbors, anyone who will listen, for the rest of her life. In her telling, the story becomes something larger than a soldier sharing a meal. It becomes evidence that humanity persisted even in war's worst darkness. And something else happens. Other soldiers in Hendricks' company, having seen no punishment befall him, begin making their own quiet decisions. Private Walsh shares his rations with a German child he finds searching through garbage. Corporal James Peterson helps an elderly German couple salvage belongings from their bombed home. These actions remain small, unofficial, deniable. But they multiply. By war's end, thousands of similar moments occur across Germany. Individual soldiers, acting against orders, making personal choices to extend compassion to former enemies. History rarely records these moments. They don't appear in after-action reports or official histories. But they happen over and over, small acts of decency in a landscape of destruction. James Hendricks' decision to share his last meal wasn't unique, but it was far from universal. The question worth examining is why some soldiers could extend compassion while others could not, and what that reveals about human nature under extreme circumstances. The psychological literature on wartime behavior identifies several factors that enable compassion toward enemy populations. Physical proximity matters. It's easier to hate an abstract enemy than a specific suffering individual in front of you. Hendricks didn't hate Germans. He saw one woman dying, and that immediate reality overwhelmed abstract categories. Personal experience shapes responses. Soldiers who'd witnessed concentration camps often felt less sympathy for German civilians, viewing them as complicit in atrocities. But soldiers like Hendricks, whose combat experience centered on conventional warfare rather than liberating camps, sometimes maintained more capacity for empathy. Pre-war values persist even through combat trauma. Hendricks' squad mates remembered him as someone who helped others instinctively before the war. That characteristic survived military training and combat exposure. The war didn't erase who he'd been. It tested whether that core identity could withstand pressure. But perhaps the most important factor is simple moral courage. Hendricks faced real consequences for his choice. He violated explicit orders. He risked court-martial, loss of rank, even imprisonment. He knew this and chose compassion anyway. That requires a particular kind of bravery distinct from combat courage, the willingness to stand alone against institutional authority when conscience demands it. His act also challenges comfortable narratives about the Second World War. The conflict is often remembered as a clear moral crusade, good versus evil with sharp boundaries. That's true in the strategic sense. Nazi Germany represented genuine evil that had to be defeated. But at the individual level, the moral landscape was more complex. Hendricks recognized that defeating Nazi Germany didn't require cruelty toward every individual German. You could fight the regime while helping the person. This distinction matters because it addresses a fundamental tension in warfare. How do soldiers maintain their humanity while doing violence? How do they distinguish between necessary military action and unnecessary cruelty? Hendricks navigated this tension intuitively. He'd fired his rifle at German soldiers when combat required it. But he'd also fed a starving German woman when compassion required that. He held both truths simultaneously without contradiction. Other historical examples illuminate this pattern. During the Civil War, soldiers from opposing sides sometimes shared rations during temporary truces. In the First World War, the famous Christmas truce of 1914 saw British and German soldiers exchanging food and cigarettes in no man's land. Even in the Pacific Theater, where racial hatred ran deepest, some American soldiers provided medical care to wounded Japanese prisoners despite intense cultural pressure not to. These moments don't excuse the horrors of war. They don't minimize the genuine evil that made warfare necessary. But they demonstrate that even in war's worst extremity, some individuals refuse to surrender their humanity. They insist on seeing the enemy as human, even when doing so violates orders and risks punishment. The days following James Hendricks' encounter with Margarete Fischer blur into the chaotic final phase of the European War. Germany surrenders on May 8, 1945. The shooting stops, but the humanitarian crisis intensifies. Millions of displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, and refugees require food, shelter, and medical care. The American army, stretched thin, struggles to manage the catastrophe. Hendricks remains in Germany through the summer of 1945 as part of the occupation forces. He never speaks about feeding Fischer, never mentions it in letters home, never seeks recognition. In his mind, it was simply something he did once, no more noteworthy than any other day. He's discharged in November 1945 and returns to Terre Haute. He uses the GI Bill to attend technical school, becomes a machinist, marries a woman named Dorothy he'd known before the war. They have 3 children. He works steady jobs, attends his kids' baseball games, mows his lawn on Saturdays. He rarely discusses the war except at VFW meetings, and even then he talks about other things, not the meal he shared. In 1983, 38 years after that April day, Hendricks receives an unexpected letter. It's from Germany, forwarded through multiple channels. The writer is Margarete Fischer's daughter, Helene, who has spent years searching for the American soldier who saved her mother's life. Fischer had died in 1979, but before her death, she'd made her children promise to find the soldier if possible. Helene hired researchers, contacted American military archives, interviewed elderly Germans who'd been in Nuremberg in April 1945. The search took 4 years. Finally, through a combination of military records, unit histories, and interviews with surviving soldiers from Hendricks' company, she identified him. The letter, translated into English, runs 4 pages. Helene describes how her mother's encounter with Hendricks shaped her understanding of Americans, of enemies, of humanity. How Fischer, who'd lost faith in human decency after years of war and deprivation, regained it because one soldier chose compassion. How that restored faith influenced how Fischer raised her children, teaching them that people could choose goodness even when circumstances seemed to forbid it. The letter ends with an invitation. If Hendricks ever comes to Germany, Helene would be honored to meet him. Hendricks reads the letter 3 times, sitting at his kitchen table while coffee grows cold. Dorothy finds him there an hour later, tears running down his face. "I didn't think it mattered," he tells her. "I never thought anybody remembered. It was just one meal." But it wasn't just one meal. It was evidence, in a moment when evidence seemed desperately scarce, that human beings could choose compassion over cruelty, mercy over vengeance, connection over division. It was proof that even in war's darkest hours, individuals retain the power to act according to conscience rather than command. Hendricks never travels to Germany. His health is declining by the 1980s, heart disease from decades of smoking catching up with him. But he corresponds with Helene Fischer for the remaining years of his life. In one letter, he tries to explain his decision that April day. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he writes. "I wasn't making some grand statement. I just saw somebody suffering and I could help, so I did. I think most people would have done the same if they'd been standing where I stood. The war made us see each other as enemies, but she was just a person. Hungry. Dying. I couldn't walk away from that." Maybe he's right. Maybe most people would have helped. But the historical record suggests otherwise. Most soldiers followed orders. Most walked past the suffering Germans. Most maintained the emotional distance that military discipline required. Hendricks was not most soldiers. He died in 1989 at age 66. His obituary in the Terre Haute Tribune-Star mentioned his war service in passing. It didn't mention the meal he shared or the life he saved. But in a small town in Germany, Helene Fischer keeps a photograph of James Hendricks on her mantle. She's never met him in person, only corresponded. The photo shows a young soldier in 1943, before the hardness of combat etched itself onto his face. She tells her grandchildren about him, about the day he saved their great-grandmother's life by giving away the only food he had. "Remember this," she tells them. "Remember that when everything seems dark, when hatred seems overwhelming, individual people can still choose differently. One person with the courage to be kind can matter more than you imagine." The lesson of James Hendricks' meal extends beyond the specific circumstances of April 1945. It speaks to enduring questions about human nature, about the capacity for compassion even in contexts designed to extinguish it, about the power of individual moral choice in the face of institutional demands. We live in an era increasingly defined by tribal divisions, where people sort themselves into opposing camps and view the other side with suspicion or contempt. The temptation to dehumanize those we disagree with, to reduce complex individuals to simple categories of friend or enemy, remains powerful. War represents the temptation in its most extreme form, where dehumanization becomes systematic, deliberate, and often necessary for survival. Hendricks' choice demonstrates that we need not surrender to that temptation completely. Even in war, even when facing people his country had defined as enemies, he retained the capacity to see an individual human being and respond with compassion. That didn't make him weak. It didn't compromise his effectiveness as a soldier. It made him fully human in circumstances designed to strip humanity away. The meal he shared changed nothing strategic. Germany still surrendered. The war ended on schedule. One woman's survival didn't alter history's trajectory, but it altered individual histories. Fischer lived, raised her children, passed on lessons about kindness to subsequent generations. Hendricks returned home, knowing he'd honored his own values even under extreme pressure. The soldiers who witnessed his action carried that example with them, a reminder that orders and regulations don't absolve individuals of moral responsibility. That's the point, finally. We remain responsible for our choices even when institutional authority demands compliance. We retain the power to extend mercy even when vengeance seems justified. We preserve our humanity not by avoiding war's cruelties, but by refusing to let those cruelties corrupt who we fundamentally are. James Hendricks gave his only meal to a dying German woman on an April afternoon in 1945. It was a small act, forgotten by history, unrecorded in official documents, rewarded with nothing but an officer's quiet approval and a replacement chocolate bar. And it mattered more than most of the battles he fought, more than the decorations he never received, more than anything that would appear in his military records. Because in the end, we're measured not by how well we follow orders, but by whether we remain human when everything conspires to make us something less.